Yeah, the lecture for this afternoon is different from what was initially scheduled, but never mind. I want to approach the topic of categorization. So this will cover things like prototype categories, the basic level, the notion of the basic level. I'll also say something about, not just about categories like birds and fish and things, but also say some things about the categories in language itself, namely constructions. If you regard constructions as categories, which is reasonable, we'll discover that things that we learn about categories like birds also apply, interestingly, to categories like syntactic constructions and linguistic constructions. Anyway, the topic of categorization is quite an important one. And I want to begin with this rather significant quotation from William Labov, which you may remember if you know my book, Linguistic Categorization, I quote at the very beginning. Now, this comes from Labov's very well-known and very influential paper dealing with the categorization of drinking vessels, cups and mugs and bowls and vases, which you may be familiar with. Anyway, he makes this rather interesting statement. If linguistics can be said to be any one thing, it is the study of categories. So that is a very strong statement. If linguistics is anything, it's the study of categories. And then he goes on to explain, that is, the study of how language translates meaning into sound through the categorization of reality into units and sets of units. So, coming back to the symbolic thesis once again, language relates sounds, expressions, and meanings. If you're talking about the world, if you're describing a scene through language, you've got to categorize that scene in such a way that it can be symbolized in language. Okay, so the study of how language translates meaning into sound through the categorization of reality into units and sets of units. The idea behind this is that in reality, that is what we perceive and so on, there are no categories, there are no units. It is we as speakers who impose categories on the world around us. So, strictly speaking, every two events are different. Strictly speaking, two individuals, two things are different. But for the purpose of using language, we actually regard different things as being the same. So we don't have a name for every different thing that exists, because there would be an infinite number of names. We have to simplify reality. We categorize it into distinct units and sets of units, that is, categories of things. Right. Now, the linguistic units we are talking about here are, of course, in the first instance, words. The English word tree, is the name not of a particular thing, but of a set of things that you call trees. So the word tree, you can say, okay, what does the word tree mean? Well, the concept of a tree. And what is the concept tree? Well, a useful way of thinking what the concept tree is, or what the meaning of tree is to say that the meaning is the name of a concept, the name of a category. The category is the category tree, and to know the word tree, to know what it means, is to know what that category is, to know when something belongs in the category, to know the circumstances under which you can call a thing a tree, if you like. So, when talking about linguistic units designating categories, in the first instance one thinks of words. Words have meanings, and the meaning of a word you can think of as the name of a category. But of course there are lots of other meaningful things in language, not just the words as such. There are morphemes, bound morphemes, for example, inflectional morphemes, even something like the plural morpheme, the S on the end of a noun. That the plural morpheme has a meaning. It designates a category. The category is rather schematic. Come back to this morning's talk. The plural morpheme designates a plurality of entities. So the plural, as opposed to the singular, has a meaning, and the meaning can be understood in terms of the categories that the plural morpheme designates. Or to put it another way, if you use a noun in the plural form, you have already categorized the referent as plural. Right? Similarly, if you use a verb in the past tense, you have categorized the event as past. Well, there are other meanings of the past tense, but simplifying somewhat. Now, there are other categories in language which there are other syntactic categories in language which designate sort of conceptual categories. For example, transitive clauses. A transitive clause, the farmer shot the rabbit, subject, verb, object. That you can look at the transitive clause as a syntactic thing with a subject, verb, object. But also a transitive clause, by using a transitive clause, you have categorized what you're talking about as a transitive event, if you like, with an agent, an event, and a patient. Somebody who does something to something. So by using a transitive clause, you have categorized the situation that you are talking about. I mentioned here also possessive nominals, that is, things like my, car, my, name, and so on. By using the possessive construction, the my, something, you are in fact categorizing the relation between things as a possessive relation. What exactly the possessive relation is another matter. Okay, it's rather more complex, but you get the idea that by using a particular syntactic construction, by using a particular, say, grammatical form or syntactic construction, you are in fact categorizing what you were talking about in terms of the category designated by that particular syntactic construction. So, when Lebov talked about the translation of meaning into sound through the categorization of reality, as I say, one thinks in the first instance of words as the names of categories, but syntactic and morphological things in a language also are the names of categories. The categories in this case are probably, well, generally, much more abstract, much more schematic. That basically is the difference between words and syntax, meaning the categories designated by words are usually much more precise, much more contentful than the categories designated by syntactic constructions. But actually we can go further than what Lebov said. So if linguistics is anything, it's a study of categories. You can also look at this from the point of view that language itself consists of categories. It's not just that language is used to refer to categories, but language itself consists of categories. And these are, of course, the kinds of elements that linguists use in describing language. Sound, for example. If you say the same word twice, it will be pronounced differently. There will be acoustic differences between two pronunciations. Nevertheless, within a particular language, you regard the two pronunciations as the same. The sounds have been categorized. So you're not just categorizing what you're talking about, but the language itself consists of categories. Two pronunciations of the same word, by the same speaker, by different speakers, there will be differences. Okay? But within the language itself, those two pronunciations count as the same. So sounds are categorized. The basic elements of phonemes, they are categories. The sound shape of a word is a category. And to know the pronunciation of a word is to know what counts as a pronunciation of the word. Okay? What possible ways there are of pronouncing that word. That is to know the acoustic, the phonetic category, the sound shape of the word. But also there are, of course, grammatical categories, nouns, verbs, and all the rest of them. And syntactic categories, noun phrases, clauses, and so on. And then there are constructions, idioms, and constructional idioms, which I'll say more about later. So language itself is a set of categories of various kinds. So Lebov certainly was correct when he said that language, so to study linguistics is basically to study categories. Okay. Now, I want to now bring in another quotation from Saussure, the Swiss linguist who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century his very important book on well, he didn't actually write the book. It was lecture notes which his students got together after he died. But Saussure's course in general linguistics is one of the landmark events in Western linguistics, in modern linguistics. And Saussure made these somewhat controversial comments. Probably he was wrong, but let's look at them anyway. So psychologically, this is translated from the French in Harris's very good translation. This was the date of the original publication was about 1916, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, psychologically, setting aside its expression in words, so our thought is simply a vague, shapeless mess. Were it not for signs, that is, symbolic units, as we had this morning, basically language, we should be incapable of differentiating any two ideas in a clear and constant way. In itself, thought is like a swirling cloud where no shape is intrinsically determinate. No ideas are established in advance, and nothing is distinct before the introduction of linguistic structure. In other words, without language, there is no clear thought. You simply have a vague mess of stuff floating around in your brain. And it is language and the categories that language imposes which gives some structure to thought. So without language there can be no thought, he claimed. Probably he was wrong, but it's an extreme position that it is language which gives categories to the world and to your thought. Now, interestingly, Saussure also applied that in the next paragraph to sound. Now, if you listen to a language which you don't know, so a language which is completely unfamiliar to you, what do you hear? You simply hear a mess of sound. You can't really identify anything. You can't identify words. You might identify something that sounds like vowels and consonants and so on. But in a language which is completely unknown to you, all you hear is just a mess of sound. You can't identify anything in it. And Saussure claimed that basically before the acquisition of language, this is what language sounds like. The substance of sound is no more fixed or rigid than that of thought. It does not offer a ready-made mold with shapes that thought must inevitably conform to. It is a malleable material which can be fashioned into separate parts in order to supply the signals which thought is in need of. So sound, the speech signal, speech, is simply a shapeless mess of sound until you have a language by which you can identify the consonants, the vowels, the syllables, the words, and so on. So, again, by learning a language, your first language as a child, for example, you learn to categorize not just the world around you, but also you learn to categorize the language that you hear around you into words, syllables, sounds, and so on. And, as I say, it is categorization which brings structure to this vague, shapeless mess of sound and reality, with thought and sound. And through categorization, first of all, you can identify units, and secondly, different experiences or different things, although they are different in detail, can be classed together as the same. right? And to summarize what I've said before, to have a category, to know a category, to have a category is to know what can be a member of it. Doesn't mean that you have to learn a list of all the members, but to have a category is to know what could be a member of it. That is to know whether a particular chunk of experience can be an instance of a certain category or not. In other words, if you know the word tree, you have the category tree, it means you're able to recognize one when you see one. Right? And you know how to apply the word to trees. Okay. Okay, so we've looked at the importance of categories. Categories are what language is all about. Now let's look at the question of what categories are and what makes a category and on what basis things belong to a category. How do you define a category? What are the characteristics of a category? Now, the traditional view, well, the Western traditional view, which goes back a long time, it goes back 2,500 years, basically to Aristotle and the Greeks. It's a view which has influenced logic, philosophy, and linguistics. So the traditional view defines a category in terms of a conjunction that is a set of necessary and sufficient features or conditions. These are so-called classical or Aristotelian categories. That is to say, a category is defined in terms of a set of features, and the set of features define the category. The features, each feature is necessary. Without that feature, a thing cannot belong in the category, and the features together are sufficient. Given the set of features, the thing is in the category. And the classic example, the example which is always used to illustrate this, is the English word bachelor, which is an unmarried adult man. And that would be then defined in terms of four features, namely human, as opposed to non-human, male, as opposed to female, adult, as opposed to non-adult or child, and minus married, not married. Although there is some disagreement as to whether it is not married or never married. But still, now the idea is that each of these four features, human, male, adult, not married, is necessary. If what you're talking about is not a man, then that person cannot be a bachelor. Bachelor only applies to men. It only applies to humans. You can't talk about your horse as a bachelor. It only applies to adults. You can't talk about a 10-year-old boy as a bachelor. And unmarried, you can't describe a married man as a bachelor, in principle. So each of these is necessary, and together they are sufficient. If something has each of these four features, then by definition it is in the category. Okay? That is the essence then of the classical or Aristotelian category. The category which is defined by a set of necessary and sufficient features, or conditions, if you like, conditions for membership in the category. To be a member of the category, you have to have each of these features. I've also thrown in here an example from phonology, because as I said, categories are not just categories of things in the world, but also categories in the language. If you take the phoneme E, the E vowel, just about any phonological theory that you look at, any phonological text, any textbook of phonology that you will look at, will probably define the phoneme E also in terms of a set of features, set of conditions for membership. And the phoneme E, this is a category because there are many ways of pronouncing the E sound. And the features will be, first of all, it's vocalic and not a consonant. It is voiced and not voiceless. It is a high vowel, so E and not E. It is front E and not U. There might be other features like unrounded is E and not U. It would be oral, not nasal, E and not E. But you get the idea that you can actually define that particular phoneme by means of this set of features, and that is the traditional approach in phonology, the so-called distinctive features. And in fact, this notion of the classical category defined as the set of features was, in linguistics actually, was probably worked out first in phonology. It was applied first in phonology and perhaps secondarily to semantics and syntax. Okay, now, if you take this view of categories, certain things follow. One thing follows is that a category has clear boundaries. Because membership in the category is a question of these necessary and sufficient features, if you have the features, you are in the category. If you don't, you are not. So membership is either yes or no. Either you're in or you're not. Right? So the category has clear boundaries. And if something is in the category, well, it's just the same as anything else that's in the category. In other words, all members of the category have equal status within the category. They're all equally members. So if, to come back to the bachelor, anything that's human, male, adult, and never married is a bachelor by definition, and they're all the same with respect to the use of the word bachelor. Okay? So all members of the category have equal status. It also predicts the existence of analytical truths and tautologies. Now, an analytical sentence, I think I mentioned this subsequently, an analytical sentence is a sentence which is true by definition. It is true in virtue of the words which are in it. For example, a sentence, this bachelor is unmarried, is true. It's got to be true, irrespective of who you're talking about, because by definition of the word bachelor and unmarried. If you say, this bachelor is married, that sentence is by definition false. It cannot be true because of the definition, because of the meaning of bachelor and unmarried. So an analytical sentence is a sentence which is true because of the meanings of the words, as opposed to a synthetic sentence which is true or false according to whatever the world is like. Okay? And a tautology is a sentence which is uninformative. It simply says the same thing twice. So this bachelor is unmarried would be a tautology. You're not saying anything. You're not giving any information because the information that you give is already contained in the word bachelor. Okay, so those are characteristics of the classical theory. And the classical theory actually is based on certain assumptions or presuppositions. One obvious presupposition, something which the theory actually is based on, is that you have access to the features, clearly. So the features, in a sense, come first, and the category comes second. Right? If you look, where are we? The definition of bachelor, to be able to use the word bachelor, to have the category, you've got to know the features first. The features come first. So you've got to have access to the features which define the categories. But there are all sorts of problems with the classical theory. One of the problems is, what about these features which define the category? And the second point, each feature, whatever its nature, itself defines a category. So if you go back to your bachelor example, the feature plus human itself defines a category, namely of humans as opposed to non-humans. The category plus male, the feature plus male, defines the category of all male things. So the features themselves are categories, defined categories. And that sort of creates a kind of logical problem. Where do you stop? Is it features all the way down? Is it categories all the way down? Where do you stop? Do you arrive at features which are primitive? That is to say, you cannot analyze them into further features. Now that, of course, the idea that features are primitive, that is to say you can't analyze them further, is a very common idea in phonology. So vocalic, voiced, high, and front, for example, as phonological features would typically be regarded as primitive. Primitive in the sense that you can't define them in terms of further features. These are the ultimate features. And another assumption underlying the classical view, actually, is that features are binary. That is to say, either or, either plus or minus. That is necessary in order to get the clear membership within the categories. Okay. So there are certain problems about the features. What is the nature, what is the status of the features? Are they primitive or complex? Come back to Bachelor, the feature minus married. Clearly, plus minus married cannot be a primitive feature. It is a very complex feature and is tied up, of course, with cultural conditions. Marriage is a cultural phenomenon, and it's certainly not a primitive feature. Now, another question, I'll come back to this later, is that the classical theory, by defining categories in terms of a set of features, actually says nothing about good categories and bad categories. By good categories, I mean categories that are useful, and that makes sense. Right? The categories that we operate with are good categories by definition. If they weren't good, we wouldn't use them. But you can think of all sorts of categories which are theoretically possible, but which we don't use, which we would never use. I'll come back to this later. Why is it that some combinations of features make good categories rather than others? Another problem with the classical view is that classical categories actually are very uninformative. Let me put it this way. You can see that. How do you know that something is a member of a category on the classical view? Well, if you define the category in terms of your set of features, to know that something is in the category, you've got to check out each of the features. That's how they work. But having done that, so what? Having done that, what have you learned? Well, you've learned that this entity is a member of this category, and that's the end of it. You can't say anything else about it. Okay? But that actually is not how we use categories. By learning that something is a bird, let us say, you would identify it as a bird in terms of some features. You can then make predictions concerning other things. I mean, that's what categories are for. If you learn that something is a member of a category, you can make predictions or you have expectations about how it will behave, certain further properties of it. Okay, so there are theoretical problems with classical categories, but there are also empirical problems, problems of fact. One empirical problem is that the classical categories can't account for prototype effects, which I'll discuss shortly. And the other big problem with classical categories is that they're actually very difficult to find. I mentioned the Bachelor example, which everybody quotes, because that is actually one of the very few examples which works. There are very few words in a language which designate classical categories, or for which you can actually give an account in classical categories. So they simply It's extremely difficult to find good examples of classical categories in terms of the meanings of words. And that is a kind of problem. If classical theory is a theory of categories and you can't find categories that conform to the classical theory, well then you need another theory, clearly. I do hedge this by saying at least in non-expert discourse. By that I mean that in expert or scientific discourse, very often the experts, the scientists, the bureaucrats or whatever, actually specifically define words in classical terms. I'll give an example of that. Well, the word adult, okay? A bureaucrat can define an adult as anybody who is older than, whatever, 18, well, it depends in different societies. So you can define an adult as anyone who is over 18 years old, or 16, or 21, or whatever, depending on the society. So that would be a classical definition, a very clear definition. It is clear who is in and who is not in the category. Whereas the everyday use of the word adult is not like this. You understand and describe people as adults on the basis of a whole set of things, like, well, age is obviously one, but maturity would be another, independence would be another. So a whole set of characteristics, and exactly who is in and who is not in the category is not clear-cut. Okay? So, where are we? Now, okay, so one of the problems with your classical categories is that they can't account for prototype effects. Now, what are these prototype effects? Well, this is the fact which has been demonstrated very often and repeatedly, that some members of a category are judged to be better examples than others. If you take the word adult, you can think of representative examples of adults and people who are sort of borderline cases. And this is the question of the degree of representativity, the extent to which certain things are good examples of the particular category. Take the case of bird. The representative case would be, little songbirds which fly around and sit in trees and sing, right? That would be those would be your representative birds, as opposed to penguins or ostriches, which are birds. It's not that ostriches are not birds. They are birds, but they're not good examples of birds. They don't fly, they don't sing, they are quite vicious. Okay, so, and they're big. The typical bird is a little thing, but your big ones are not good examples. So the degree of representativity within the category. So some birds are better examples than others, even though they're all still birds. You can put it this way: if somebody asks you to draw a picture of a bird, or you close your eyes and form a mental image of a bird, what do you visualize? Well, you probably visualize a small songbird. You wouldn't visualize a duck, probably, or you may. So this is the question of the degree of representativity within the category. And this, of course, applies not just to things like birds, but it would also apply to things in language itself. If you take as I mentioned earlier, the category of the transitive clause, subject, verb, object, a good example of a transitive clause would be simply something like the farmer shot the rabbit. Right? A not very good example would be the farmer likes the rabbit. So Shoot is a good transitive verb. Like is not a very good transitive verb. They're both transitive verbs, but the one is more representative. It's a better example than the other. And the second point, and these two things actually have to be kept distinct. They're not the same. Some members of a category might actually have unclear or ambiguous status. They might be marginal members. They might be sort of halfway in this and halfway in that. They might be on the borderline between two categories. Or the category has fuzzy boundaries. That is to say, it's not quite clear where the category stops. And a very nice example of that is, of course, color categories. If you take red and orange are two color categories, but clearly the one gradually goes into the other. And whereas you can have good examples of red, I suppose that's a nice example of red, and good examples of orange, don't have any, anyway, clearly you can have colors which are sort of halfway between. They're halfway between red and orange, so 50% one and 50% of the other. So the boundary of the category red is not clear-cut. Right? And I mentioned earlier Lebov's experiment with cups and bowls and so on. If you're given something that is shaped more or less like this, that is a sort of cup shape, and that is a bowl shape, and that is a vase shape, roughly. So, cup. Okay? And what he did in his experiment, he gave people drawings and asked them, what is it, a cup, a bowl, or a vase? And the point is, you can see that this shape can gradually change into that. You simply make this gradually taller, and here, this can gradually shape into that by like that. And of course, what he found, as you can predict, was that as this gradually became that, more and more people said it was a bowl rather than a cup. So there was a kind of shape halfway between, which was sort of both the cup and the bowl, but not a good example of either of them. And likewise, as the sides got taller, it became more and more like a vase. So here, these categories, although cups, bowls, and vases are different, clearly they merge together. They have fuzzy boundaries. Okay. And clearly that is something that your classical categories cannot predict or cannot even account for. Now, the research on prototype categories was done basically in the 1970s by Eleanor Roche, who was a psychologist. And there's a lot of empirical evidence supporting the notion of the prototype category. I'll just give you an example. This is the category furniture. And the experiment is very, very simple. I mean, you can easily repeat it. She gave people a list of words, of things that you find in a house, and asked people to judge or to estimate to what extent these things were good examples of furniture. So this ranged from bed, table, sofa, and cupboard, which, as you see, were judged to be very good examples of the category, down to, at the bottom, stereo, pillow, telephone, and ashtray, which were judged to be not really furniture at all. And sort of things in the middle, like a mirror, or a clock, or a stool, or a television set. Are those furniture or not? So the category of furniture, in fact, is not clear-cut. So is this going to work? Yes. Okay. Okay. Now. Okay, so the notion of the prototype category, the number of things follow from the prototype notion. First of all, the category may well have fuzzy boundaries. It doesn't have to have. The category of bird probably does not have fuzzy boundaries. It's quite clear whether something is or is not In the case of cups and bowls and reds and oranges, categories may merge with neighboring categories. You have degrees of membership within a category. And also, the prototype notion makes an interesting prediction for acquisition, how you learn these things. You would expect that categories would be acquired first on the basis of the prototype. That you would learn a category, first of all, on the basis of typical examples, typical and representative examples. And then you would gradually extend the word to not so representative examples. In other words, you would learn the word furniture on the basis of beds, tables, and chairs, not telephones, mirrors, and clocks. Right? So the idea would be that you would learn the categories on the basis of their typical representative examples, and then you would learn about all the other marginal fuzzy cases. I can, just a moment. Nice example of that. Let's see. Okay, this is some stuff taken from the third edition of my categorization book. This is some data taken from children acquiring English as their first language. And it's interesting to see. Okay, these are examples from each is the case from a particular child, one particular child, the first use of the word, and then subsequent uses. For example, off. So the child first used off to refer to somebody taking off an article of clothing. So off meant simply take your coat off, or take your shoes off. Okay? So first of all, off was simply used, initially used when the child removes the clothing from her or somebody else's body. So taking off clothes. So off meant taking clothes off. The first prototypical, the first central use of the word off by the child. Then subsequent uses, when seeing somebody else remove an article of clothing. Okay, so off simply to do with taking clothes off. But then the next use was while trying to pull away from her mother. So the child is with the mother, then tries to get away from the mother. So off then comes to mean not just taking off clothes, but separating things, right? The idea of separation. Now, of course, to get away, the child gets away from her mother. That would actually not be called off in English. It would be to get away from. So the child has extended the word off to mean simply that kind of motion, which is actually not the standard one. So you see the child has the initial sense and then sort of extending it. So trying to get away from the mother while pulling a toy out of a carry cot. So you have a kind of cot or something, and you take something out of. This is out of, but the child is doing off in that sense. Again, the idea of separation. And then a final use to getting off a train. Here, this does correspond to the adult use, but again, the idea of separation. So what happens is that the child uses the word off to refer to a prototypical scene of taking clothes off. First of all, off herself, and then seeing somebody else do it. And then this idea of, well, the clothes get separated from you. This then gets extended to things that are similar. Right? So it has the central prototypical use, and then similar things gets brought into the category. And of course, the child's experiments here sometimes conform to adult usage, but sometimes don't. Okay? Interesting, rather nice one is the final one here, if you can see that. The word umbrella. The child, first of all, used the word umbrella of the open umbrella, that is, that sort of shape. Did not use the word of a closed umbrella. So used the word umbrella for the open umbrella. That was the prototype, the open umbrella. And then used the word of a large green leaf. So what's happening there? Well, it's the shape, of course. It's the covering shape. and then of a kite flying in the sky, you know, but not of a closed umbrella. So you see the word umbrella was first used to, if you like, the prototypical use of the umbrella, when you hold it to keep the rain off you. And that was then got extended to things that were similar in shape, a large leaf that you would put over your head, for example. Okay. So the kinds of errors, if you like, that children make when they acquire words give some indication of how they build up the categories. And it would seem that they do not build up the categories feature by feature, by adding features, but it seems they would start with a kind of prototypical use, a prototypical image, which then gets extended to other uses. Okay. So categories, oh, sorry, come back to that. Yes. So, point 4, categories may be acquired from the prototype outwards, and perhaps with a stage of overextension, so the child doesn't always get it right. Now, another aspect of prototype categories is that knowledge of the features does not have to precede the learning of the category. Another aspect of prototype categories is that by nature they are flexible. That is, you can extend them in different kinds of ways, and this is useful because they are then able to accommodate new experiences and a changing world. Now this, as I say, has some implications for learning. Classical categories have to be built up by assembling their defining features. Prototype categories may be learned through familiarity with prototypical examples, followed by extensions from the prototype. Okay, some examples. For example, take the past tense in English, for example. Okay, every verb can appear with the past tense, as we know. And you might think, well, the past tense is the past tense, what's the problem? But it seems that children, when they learn the past tense, they don't apply it immediately to everything. They apply it only to certain kinds of verbs, namely verbs which describe an event, the results of which are... What's that? Okay? Is that me? Anyway. Was that the end of the class or something? Okay. So, the past tense. Now, you might think, well, what is the problem with the past tense? Well, it seems that children acquiring English, when they learn the past tense, they do not apply the past tense to every verb that they know. They learn the past tense first on a certain class of verbs. Verbs like to break is a typical one. If something breaks, or if you break something, the result of this is visible, right? If something is broken, you can see that it's broken. Whereas, and this is the kind of verb that children typically use first of all in the past tense. To break, to hit, to fall, whatever. So, and this, you can say, possibly the prototypical use of the past tense, to describe an event in the past which causes something to change, and the results of this change are now visible. So children do not, first of all, use the past tense on verbs like to say or to think. They do subsequently, obviously, but the first uses would typically be verbs like to fall and to break and to hit and so on. Okay, there's one further point about classical categories. No, sorry, I'll come back to that later when we talk about taxonomies and so on. Right. Okay, so I've said quite a lot about prototype categories and so on, with some examples. But there are some distinctions which I think are important to make, which are quite useful in this respect. When talking about categories, some distinctions which are important. First of all, the distinction between, I've mentioned this already briefly, between folk categories and expert categories. Think of the word adult, a word in everyday use. As the word is used in everyday speech, it refers to what you might call a folk category. I'm not using folk in any sort of negative sense. The category that people normally operate with in everyday speech and everyday language. So an adult would be, say, somebody with a certain maturity, certain responsibility, and so on and so forth. Whereas the expert category is the category as defined by experts. And the experts could be the scientists, they could be bureaucrats, they could be politicians, they could be linguists, they could be whatever. People who are supposed to know would define their categories. Linguists, for example, might define language and dialect or whatever to give expert definitions of these, whereas in everyday language these words would be used rather more flexibly, shall we say. To some extent, lawyers, the legal profession is concerned with giving expert definitions. If you take legal concepts like, fraud, what is fraud? Well, lawyers would have to operate with basically classical-like categories in order to determine whether a particular event, a particular action is or is not an example of fraud or not. So, okay, yeah, law, in fact, is very much a matter of the meanings of words, and hence also of categories, actually. A second distinction is important, the distinction between natural and nominal kinds. A natural kind, these are categories of things in the world of nature. Categories of plants, animals, minerals, chemicals, natural phenomena, and so on. Bird and sparrow, these would be natural kinds. Nominal kinds would be categories that are not actually in nature, but we make them. For example, the category of chair. Chair is not a natural kind. Chair is the name of something that we make. Furniture is not a natural kind. Vehicle would be not a natural kind. So nominal kinds would be things that are not actually in nature, but we make them, we define them. Okay. And in interest, and this ties up with a distinction which John Searle, who you may know from his speech act theory, John Searle made an interesting distinction between what he called brute facts and institutional facts. A brute fact is something which is a fact irrespective of human beings, right? The fact that water is H2O is a brute fact, right? The fact that birds fly is a brute fact. It is true, it will be a fact independent of human beings. Institutional facts are facts created by humans, basically by categorizing. We say that this is a member of this category because. So the category of a vehicle is not a brute fact. Vehicles don't exist independently of humans. A vehicle is something that we use for the purpose of getting ourselves somewhere. So we define something as a vehicle because of what we do with it. Okay? So the institutional facts tend to be the nominal kinds, things that you define in terms of our particular interests and concerns. Okay. So where are we? Now, another interesting fact about categories, I mentioned that prototype categories tend to be flexible. They can adapt they can be modified according to the circumstances. Now, categories can be redefined and restructured, and they often are in everyday speech. And we can actually redefine our categories or highlight certain aspects of our categories through the use of so-called hedges. Hedges are things like, real, par excellence, technically speaking, strictly speaking, sort of, kind of, so-called, and so on. So you can actually slightly modify the meanings of words. You modify the definition or your understanding of a category as you need, right? Classical categories, of course, you can't do that. They are fixed. But prototype categories, or the categories that we operate with, you can actually modify them. Now, here are some examples. First of all, in that is a pretty harmless-looking expression, but in that is often used, in fact, to redefine a category or to explain the basis of the categorization. He's a friend of mine in that I've known him for years, but we really don't have much in common. Okay? He's a friend of mine in that I've known him for years, but we really don't have much in common. Okay? What I'm doing there, or what the speaker is doing there, is taking the word friend, okay, whatever the definition of friend is, and the speaker then gives the reason why this person is categorized as a friend. I've known him for years. So the length of time you've known somebody then becomes the criterion for saying he's a friend. But you're denying another possible criterion for being a friend, namely to have something in common with the person. And so in that is a hedge. It's used to actually redefine or to re-weight the features of a category. Now, the next few examples I'm going to give here have been taken from the BNC, the British National Corpus. I don't know whether you're familiar with the British National Corpus. And I mentioned this morning that one of the trends in cognitive linguistics nowadays is to rely less and less on invented data and more on actual data. And where do you find actual data? Well, the best source is a corpus. And the British National Corpus, it was compiled about 10 years ago, I think. It is a corpus consisting of 100 million words, which is quite a lot. 100 million words of basically British English, taken from various registers, spoken, written, journalistic, novels, and so on. Okay. If you want to find out about the British National Corpus, you can actually access it online. Well, not the whole thing. For the whole thing, you've got to pay. But you can access it on this website, SARA, NatCorp, Oxford, AC, UK. And you can actually put in you can get a sample of uses. You put in your word or your phrase, and it comes out with 50 random examples of how that word is used. The second one, actually, that's a way of getting into the British National Corpus by the back door, so to speak. You can actually access quite a lot of it through that second website, if you want to write that down. So the British National Corpus of 100 million words is actually one of the is an important research tool in, well, modern linguistics. I think there's actually a Chinese corpus for research use as well. Not all languages have a nice corpus provided. But the BNC is... there's also, I think, an American national corpus which has been completed. I think you have to pay more for it. Anyway, what I did, I got some of these examples here are from the British National Corpus in that. And this is one example from the BNC. It becomes a cash cow business in that you generate a lot of money from existing assets. Don't know whether you know the expression a cash cow. A cash cow is some business operation which brings in lots and lots of money for very little work. So a business operation which earns you lots and lots of money for very little work. A cash cow business is like having a cow which, gives you not milk but money. So it's a cash cow business in that, and then the speaker says on what basis it is categorized as a cash cow business, in that you generate a lot of money from your existing assets. You don't have to buy new assets, you don't have to set up new structures, use what you've got and make money. The next examples are with another hedge, the hedge technically speaking. Now, technically speaking is a hedge which tends to focus on, the technical, or if you like, the expert definition. And the last example is a nice one. Technically speaking, as long as no one was hurt, no injuries, no damage to the other vehicle, this is not an accident. Okay, so how do you define an accident? How do you define a road accident, a car accident? When do you say that an accident has happened or an accident has not happened? How would the traffic police, for example, categorize an event as an accident or not an accident? Well, here the speaker appeals to a technical definition of an accident. An accident would be somebody gets hurt, somebody is injured, and the other vehicle is damaged. So somebody is hurt, somebody is injured, and the other vehicle is damaged. So if you're driving along and damage your own vehicle, nobody else's vehicle, no one is hurt, is that an accident? Well, technically speaking, it is not. Right? So here the speaker is appealing to a technical definition of an accident. And another one, the earlier one, well, yes, technically speaking, I suppose it is burnt, but well done is what I would call it. So the context here would be you're cooking something. Is it burnt or is it well done? Okay? Well, technically speaking, I suppose it is burnt, as opposed as being flames coming from it. But I would call it well done. So here, the speaker is playing with two different categorizations of the event and say, well, technically speaking, maybe it is burnt, but, well, I would call it something else. And here are a few more with loosely speaking, from technically speaking. The second one is perhaps an easy one. But then, looking at it another way, I am, loosely speaking, the government. The government says, the government believes, the government wants. Who is the government? Well, I don't know who is saying this, perhaps a prime minister or president. Well, technically, loosely speaking, that's me. Okay? Now, strictly speaking, this is actually rather a nice one. Strictly speaking, the term kilobyte should mean 1,000 bytes, but 1,024 is close enough. So kilobyte, kilo meaning 1,000. Strictly speaking, a kilobyte should be 1,000 of them, but not 1,024. So there you have the idea of the strict use of the word. Strict imposes a boundary, either in or out. And 1,024 is not 1,000. But loosely speaking, a kilobyte is more or less 1,000. Or this one here, the most important book I possessed was not, strictly speaking, a book at all. Which is a bit odd. The most important book I possessed was not a book. It's sort of it will appear to be a contradiction. The book I possessed was not a book. The speaker justifies this by appealing to a strict definition of book. So a strict definition of book, whatever that would be, I don't know, something that is, well, it's actually difficult to give a strict definition of book. Perhaps something that is bound, it's big, it's made of paper, or this sort of size. So has the sound gone? certainly recommend. I should perhaps mention at this point that a number of people have raised objections to the prototype view. And there are, well, a couple of well-known cases which Lakoff has discussed quite extensively. Prototype effects, that is, you judge, say, table to be a better example of furniture than the telephone or a mirror. It was found that prototype effects show up even with categories that have clearly defined boundaries, such as odd number. There's the well-known experiment by Armstrong and Gleitman, which showed that when people are asked, they judge the number 3 to be a better odd number than, I don't know, 755. Which, if you think about it, is nonsense. An odd number is an odd number. An odd number, a number that you can't divide by 2. And yet people judge 7 to be a better odd number, a more representative odd number than, say, 755. All sorts of reasons for that, of course. But of course, one point there is you must distinguish representativity from fuzziness. The fact that all odd numbers are odd, that the category of odd number has clear boundary, still makes it possible that you can have prototype effects. And there are various explanations that can be offered for that. Odd number would seem to be applied, the best examples of odd numbers would seem to be single digits, and would seem also to be prime numbers. So 3, 5, 7 are better examples than 9, okay? And better examples than 25. Okay. The other problem is that I refer to it as the problem of the pet fish. Don't know whether you're familiar with that. If you take fish, what does your prototypical fish look like? It's sort of, that sort of shape, right? A herring or something. What is your prototypical pet? It would be a dog. Okay. What is your prototypical pet fish? A sort of goldfish, little thing that you have in a bowl. Now the problem there is, the prototypical pet fish is not the prototypical pet, which also happens to be the prototypical fish. Right? And that then is a problem of conceptual combination. If you combine the concept of a pet with the concept of a fish, what are you combining? And the argument would go, you are not combining the prototypes. Right? So you don't say, these are your prototypical pets, these are your prototypical fish, and your prototypical pet fish are those things which happen to be both prototypical fish and prototypical pets. It would seem that to get the notion of pet fish, you combine not the prototype, but actually something like a classical category of a fish, something that's swim in the sea, and a pet, some kind of animal that you keep in the house. You combine these two, and then you get a fish that you keep in the house as a pet, and then you think of what are the typical examples of that. Well, little goldfish swimming around. You would not keep herrings as pet fish or whatever. There are various ways of getting around these problems, but one thing that has been suggested on the basis of these kinds of considerations is that word meanings, concepts in fact, could be defined in terms of a distinction between what you might call the core meaning, the real meaning of the word, and criteria which you use for recognizing it. So the core, the real meaning of odd number would be any number that you cannot divide by 2 without a remainder. Okay? That would be the core, the real definition. But the recognition procedure would be, well, to see whether a number is odd or not, you don't have to divide the whole number by 2. You simply look at the final digit. If it's 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9, it is odd. So there's a recognition procedure and the real definition. But to some extent, this distinction is, as I explained at the bottom, basically that is simply a variation on the expert versus the folk theory. So the folk theory, the folk definition of many concepts would in fact appeal to what it looks like, rather than what it really is. And of course, there are many categories where it doesn't really make sense to have a distinction between the core and the recognition. Okay? I just quote here the example of the preposition in. If you use the preposition in, or on, or whatever, to say this is in that, or this is on that, by using the preposition, you have categorized the spatial relation. Okay? So to use in versus on, or whatever, the choice of one or the other is based on the categorization of the spatial relation. So that is kind of on relation, that is sort of in relation. And there to distinguish between the real nature of the in and on relation and the recognition procedure, I mean, that's simply absurd. I mean, there is no distinction between the real spatial relation and the recognition procedure. Okay. The next topic, a related topic, is the notion of the basic level. This is very closely connected with the notion of the prototype category. Okay, many categories, especially natural categories, categories of things in the world, many categories can be arranged in a taxonomy. A taxonomy is simply a way of classifying. Something like this. Animal at the top, kinds of animals, dog, cat, horse, rabbit. Then kinds of dogs, poodle, terrier, whatever. So this would be a kind of taxonomy. And then, of course, so animal at the top, then dog, cat, horse, rabbit, blah, 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 on that level. And then take dog, and then different kinds of dogs, and maybe even subcategories further on. That is a taxonomy. Very much used, of course, for the scientific classification of plants and animals, and so on. Now, within a taxonomy like this, there's a level which is the basic level. That is to say, the level at which you would normally call things. If there's a dog, well, that's what you call it. If somebody says to you, what do you call that thing in English, you would say, well, it's a dog. You would not say, well, that's an animal, even though it is. You would probably not say, well, there are circumstances in which you would say it's a poodle, but as distinct from some other kind of dog. But I say dog, cat, horse, cow. These are your basic level terms, the level in a taxonomy at which you normally name things, unless there are reasons to the contrary. So this, as I say, applies especially to natural kinds, the plants, animals, and things like that. But you can also apply it, although perhaps not so convincingly, to words other than nouns. Verbs, for example. Verbs, it doesn't work quite so well. But you can say move, something moves. And then you have ways of moving. You can run and you can walk. Would be ways of running, ways of moving. And walk, you can have different kinds of walking. You can stroll, you can amble, you can saunter. Lots of these more specialized words for different kinds of walking, if you like. But again, walk and run would be the basic level term. That's the level within this sort of taxonomy at which you would normally describe how somebody is moving. Okay? So the basic level. So characteristics of the basic level. The level in a taxonomy at which you normally name things, or the level at which you normally talk about things. Okay? The basic level terms tend to be, well, basic level terms, well, because this is the level you normally name things, basic level terms are therefore frequent in use. They are used frequently. I mean, walk is more frequent than stroll. They tend to be short. They tend to be morphologically simple, short monosyllable words in English. They are words which are learned early by children. Now, some interesting aspects of the basic level is, let's go back a moment here. Yeah, if you come back to animal and dog and cat, if you try to form a mental picture in your mind what a dog looks like, you probably can do it. If somebody asks you to draw a picture of a dog, you can do it. But if somebody asks you, draw me a picture of an animal, what do you do? What animal, you ask? So it's not possible to form a mental image of an animal as such. All you can do is form a mental image of a dog, or a cat, or a horse, or whatever. Even though, strictly speaking, you could say, well, what kind of dog? Right? But you can form a mental image of, say, a dog. Or think of the case of furniture. Draw me furniture. Form a mental image of furniture. You can't do it. All you can do is form a mental image of a chair, or a table, or a bed, or a cupboard. You can form a mental image of a chair, right? But you cannot form a mental image of furniture. Okay? I mean, there's nothing else to it. But moving, you can actually picture to yourself and imagine to yourself what you do when you run or when you walk. And also, of course, strolling and ambling and so on. So it is the highest level in the taxonomy at which you can form a mental image of something. Another feature, another aspect of mental level, basic level objects, is that you can often understand them in terms of their parts and how they are arranged. If you think of a chair, you can think of its parts. There's a seat, there are legs, there's a back. And they are arranged in a certain way. Whereas with furniture, you cannot think of what parts does furniture have. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. But for a chair, table, bed, you can think of them in terms of the parts, what they're made of, how they are arranged, what shape they are in, and so on and so forth. And you can also, the final point, imagine what you do with these things. So with a chair, you sit on it, a table, you work at it, and so on. So you know how you actually interact with these things with your body, what movements you make, what it feels like to interact with these things. Okay, so what gives basic level terms, what gives the basic level its special properties? Why is it that when you ask what is that called, you say dog rather than animal? Why does dog have basic level status, whereas animal does not? And here we come to one of the important insights again of Roche, who wrote that the task of cognitive systems is to provide maximum information with least effort. So this links up with what I was saying at the very beginning of what makes a good category. A good category is one that gives you information, maximum information with least effort. And some of the characteristics of the basic level is these. Members of the category, members of basic level categories, share many common features which they do not share with neighboring categories. In other words, tables are different from chairs in a number of ways. So all the things that are tables have things in common, things that are chairs have things in common. So they are quite clearly distinct. If you go above that to the category furniture, what are the features of furniture? Well, in fact, it's difficult to say anything very much about furniture, other than it's things that you put in your home to make life more comfortable, basically. Not much you can say about furniture. You can't even say how big it is. There are big pieces and small pieces, or what it's made of. So the higher categories tend to have very few features at all. The basic level categories have quite a few features which are distinctive. As you go below to categories below the basic level, so different kinds of chairs, different kinds of tables, yes, these have all sorts of features, but they are shared. So the categories are not distinct. So one kind of dog is very much like another kind of dog, whereas dogs and cat are different completely. So putting these two things together, the basic level turns out to be the most informative. So to know that something belongs to a basic level category gives you quite a lot of information about it, and then it sort of contrasts with the neighboring categories. Now, the pictures I gave before, like this and this, these diagrams suggest that within a taxonomy there is a basic level. Yes? But in fact, very often this actually turns out not to be the case. First of all, what is the basic level can actually possibly vary according to the degree of knowledge you have of the particular domain, of the particular area. Take, for example, the word tree. Now, if you are an urban dweller, if you live in the city, and have always lived in the city, never lived in the country, for you a tree is a tree, right? You may not be able to name different kinds of trees. A tree is sort of something like that. Tree would be a kind of basic level term, whereas for whereas for people who live in the country and who work with trees, who are close to nature, as they say, maybe tree would not be a basic level term. They would name trees by their more specific names. Okay? Interesting case is provided by the example of jeans, actually. If you take articles of clothing, okay, clothing would be a general term. The basic level terms for articles of clothing would be things like pullover, shirt, trousers, hat, shoes. These would be your basic level clothing terms. So trousers would be a basic level term, but what about jeans? Jeans would be a subcategory, presumably, of trousers. But at the same time, jeans is a kind of basic level term in itself. In other words, if you went out to buy one of these, you would say probably that you would probably use the word jeans to describe what it is that you bought rather than trousers. I think of one of the definitions of basic level, one of the characteristics is the word that you would normally use to refer to something. So on this criterion, then jeans probably would have basic level status, even though it is a member of also a basic level category. So the notion of the basic level is not actually clear cut. And possibly jeans is such a culturally salient and important category that it has acquired a basic level term in its basic level status in itself. Also, fine. Some marginal and more unusual members of a category might actually be named at the subordinate level. For example, probably for most of us, bird would be a basic level term. Unless you are an expert at birds, you would say, well, there are birds out there in the tree, or they are flying around. And duck would be a kind of bird. Okay? But if you see ducks walking across the grass, you would probably say, hey, look at the ducks, not look at the birds. So bird is basic level, duck is a kind of bird, but if there are ducks, you would call them ducks and not birds. And the reason for that probably, the reason for that probably is that ducks are actually quite distinctive birds. They have sort of features, their shape and the way they walk and they swim in the water and so on, which are not shared by other more representative members of the bird category. So there are cases where sort of marginal members are noticeable and you call them by their names rather than by using the basic level term. So the notion of the basic level is not absolutely always clear-cut. Now, the point I want to make next is that, linking this up with prototypes, prototype and basic level are very closely related notions. And one way of looking at this is to, well, as explained here, the prototype, the idea of a prototype category, it is a referential notion. And you can think of the prototype in this way. Given this linguistic expression, given this word, let us say, so we have this word, what kind of situation, what kind of thing does the word normally or most frequently refer to? So given the word bird, what is the word typically used to refer to? Okay? Or given the word furniture, what does it most typically, most commonly, most usually refer to? That then gives you the prototype. But you can think of this in the other direction. Given this thing, what do you call it? So, given this thing, this situation, this object, this state of affairs, this event or whatever, how would you typically refer to it? What expressions would you typically use to refer to it? And that, as you see, gives you the basic level. The basic level is the expression you typically use to refer to something. The prototype is the thing that a word is typically used to refer to. So, in a way, basic level and prototype are sort of inverse relations, if you like. Basic level, this is the level at which you normally refer to things. It is a salient and informative level. The question then arises, well, why do we have the other levels, actually? If you normally refer to chairs as chairs and not as furniture, what do we have the word furniture for? Okay? What do we have these higher level terms, the superordinate terms? And in fact, interestingly, the superordinate terms, words like furniture, animal, looking at acquisition, first child language acquisition, these general terms, these superordinate terms, terms above the basic level, are in fact quite difficult for children to learn, actually. It's much easier to learn chair, table, bed, than it is to learn furniture. So you can have a story like, the parents tell the child, stop jumping up and down on the furniture. And the child continues to jump up and down on the furniture. Why? Well, the child is jumping up and down on the sofa. And sofa, well, the child has learned sofa, bed, and so on, doesn't know what furniture is. So if the parent had said, stop jumping up and down on the sofa, then the child would understand. But stop jumping up and down on furniture, well... So the terms above the basic level are difficult for children to get hold of. And one reason why we use them is that it's possible to make generalizations. So think of the child jumping up and down on the sofa. What the parents want to convey to the child is, okay, don't jump up and down on the sofa, don't jump up and down on the table, don't jump up and down on the chair, don't jump up and down on the bed, don't jump up and down on furniture. Okay? So generalizations are stated at this particular level. So the superordinate level is useful for making generalizations across all sorts of categories. Also, they're often used to designate collections of things. So you go out and buy furniture, meaning, all different kinds. One use is that used for euphemistic purposes, actually. A euphemism, that is where you don't want to name something by its proper name because it's sort of embarrassing or painful. So very often you refer to illnesses simply as an illness. You don't want to name the kind of illness because it's kind of taboo. So you go for high-level terms to avoid naming things at the basic level. Or it may quite simply be that you are ignorant. You don't know what they bought, so you say they bought furniture. Right? And the subordinate terms, this is as your knowledge gets more precise, as you need to make finer distinctions, then you go into the subordinate terms. Okay, I have a number of further topics on categories. Shall I go on, or do you have questions? Shall we have 20 minutes questions at the moment? Further topics I have to talk about is where do categories come from, and what makes a good category, and then, which I won't have time for today actually, the application of all this to the study of syntactic constructions. Shall I go on, or do you have question and answer discussion? Okay, maybe we can schedule a kind of discussion for, well, if not tomorrow, perhaps the day after. Perhaps we can do it this way. If there are any particular topics that you want me to discuss, or which you disagree with, or whatever, perhaps we can collect those questions and queries, and I can talk about them perhaps on Sunday, or part of the session on Sunday, or whatever. So we can schedule half an hour or whatever, 45 minutes for kind of addressing issues that you have raised. Okay, let me then go on and talk about the question of where categories come from and what makes a good category. This actually raises an interesting question. Where do categories come from? Are categories in the world, or do we create them? This is a quotation from Worf, in 1940, not 1040. Worf, best known for the so-called Worfian hypothesis, the idea that the way you see the world is determined by the language that you speak. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, The world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds. We cut up nature, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns of our language. In other words, the categories that you see in the world are given by the language that you speak. Right? They're not there. It is your language that gives you the categories with which you see the world. And another quotation from Leach, who is an anthropologist, from 1964, I postulate that the physical and social environment of a young child is perceived as a continuum. It does not contain any intrinsically separate things. The child, in due course, is taught to impose upon this environment a kind of discriminating grid which serves to distinguish the world as being composed of a large number of separate things, each labeled with a name. This world is a representation of our language categories, not vice versa. So again, exactly the same idea. What you see is the product of your language. Because my mother tongue is English, it seems self-evident that bushes and trees are different kinds of things. I would not think this unless I had been taught this was the case. That is, taught in the process of learning the words bush and tree. This is an extreme relativist position, that languages are different, the categories that they designate are different. There are no similarities, no commonalities. The language that you speak determines how you see the world. In the case of bush and tree, well, yes. Bush and tree are, well, the distinction between bush and tree, a tree a big one, a bush a small one, basically, it's distinctive to English. And certainly bush and tree is by no means a universal distinction, right? It's a peculiarly English one. But if you were to replace bush and tree by, I don't know, elephant and table, then I don't think this argument would go through. Okay? There are discontinuities in the world, and humans are predisposed to recognize them. And also, it would seem that the categories that we construct, that our language provides for us, do obey certain cognitive principles of informativity, etc., etc. The question then of what makes a good category, well, you can approach that by saying, well, what is a bad category? What would be a bad category or a useless category? Well, a useless category, for example, would be a category, let's invent one, consisting of everything that is red, that weighs over 1 kilogram, and that was made in 1975. Okay? A nice classical category. But it's absurd, it's useless. You would never have a language, I don't think you would find a word in a language for referring to that kind of category. Why? Because it's useless. But why is it useless? Because the features are not related. Okay? Whether something is red or green or whatever, and it weighs over 1 kilo, no relation. The features have low Q validity. That is to say, I'll explain this in a moment, given a feature, you cannot predict the category. And also the category doesn't play a role in any broader conceptual frame. Now the Q validity, I mentioned there, you can understand Q validity like this. Given that you have this thing with this property P, what is the probability that this thing belongs to a certain category? For example, if something flies, there's a pretty good chance it could be a bird. It could be something else, but flying has pretty high Q validity for the bird category. But if you say, if this thing has a liver, what is the probability that it's a bird? Well, birds have livers, but so do lots of other things. So the Q validity is very, very low. And it would seem that good categories, useful categories, have features that have high validity in this sense. So if you come back to the imaginary category, the fact that something is red, does that have high validity, Q validity for this category? Well, no. Lots of things are red, but they don't have to be made in 1975. Okay, so and the converse of Q validity, if you reverse that, you get what you might call category validity. Given that something is a member of a category, what can you predict of it? Given that something is a bird, what can you say about it? That it flies? Well, a pretty good chance that it will, but it doesn't have to. So it would seem that good categories, useful categories, actually have this combination of Q and category validity. Good categories are not just random associations of features, but the features tend to be related, features tend to be distinctive of certain categories, and in this way, categorizing something can be actually useful and informative. In other words, to be told that something is a bird, you can expect quite a lot of it. You cannot predict with 100% certainty what characteristics this thing will have, but you can be quite confident that it will have certain characteristics. And in this way, categories sort of enable people to sort of make sense of the world, to reduce the variety of things in the world. And of course, because this notion of validity is not absolute, the possibility arises that different cultures, different traditions might actually categorize things slightly differently. So there is no universal set of categories. There are certainly no universal categorizations. I mean, the word meanings in one language very rarely translate into the words of another language, as we all know. But equally, the extreme relativism of Leach and Worf is also not the case. Okay, well, I think I'll finish there. Tomorrow morning, I'll actually continue this topic because I want to make some comments about how all this can be rather interestingly applied to syntactic constructions. Okay? Thank you.